prisoner's story is like that. Look, the prisoner says, wait, if I just stay silent, then I end up going to jail for theft at least, and potentially for everything. So why should I not follow my own self-interest? And so what game theory has tried to do is think about, how do you take a social dilemma and do something to change it, to make it so that self-interest and what's good for the group all point in the same direction.
Hey, legend. Thanks for joining me on another episode. The man on deck today is Kevin Zollman. He is a game theorist, and he's also a professor of philosophy at Carnegie Mellon University. I've heard a lot about game theory. I've explored it a fair bit. I've tried to understand it, and I found it way overcomplicated, very difficult to apply in my own life, and really just felt like I was reading a lot of things that made it more and more complicated. The more I learned, the harder it seemed to actually implement and actually make an impact on my life. But people kept talking about it. It keeps coming up in conversation. And that was until I met Kevin. And in this episode, this is for you if you want to get a really clear understanding of what game theory is and how to implement it in your life to improve your relationships, not just professionally, but also personally. We go through a bunch of little tactics that you can use and examples of game theory that you can use in your own life that will actually make a difference and that you can actually go and implement. So it's not too long. The episode's just a little bit over an hour, but it's packed, jam-packed. I learned more about game theory and actually went and implemented things in my life after this than I had of probably 20, 30 hours of trying to learn about it, listen to different podcasts, read different books. So check this out. He's an amazing man. I'll see you on the other side. What's up, Kevin? Pleasure to have you here in the midst of, you're finishing the semester? In the midst of a semester?
In the middle, right in the middle, yeah.
Okay, smack bang in the middle. Cool. Well, man, thanks for joining us in the middle of your busy schedule. And I'd love to jump in, give a bit of context for the audience. I've been following you for quite a while. What are you well known for? You've written a really great book, but what are you well known for in this sphere?
So I'm a philosophy professor, but who works in game theory. So I'm well known for my work in game theory, both as it's applied in economics, which is sort of what a lot of people know, but also as it's applied in biology to animals and plants and other things like that. My research sort of spans both disciplines and works on a number of different topics, including how people learn in groups, how animals come to communicate with one another, how norms of fairness can emerge in culture, and a variety of other topics like that.
Wow, fun. And we were talking before we started, and I was explaining the more I've gotten into it, the more confused I seem to be about this very important and seemingly really relevant topic to our lives. Would you mind doing a quick broad brushstroke of what is game theory in your words?
Absolutely. So game theory is the science of strategic thinking. And unpack that a little bit, what I mean by strategic thinking is any situation where you're interacting with another person and where your interests are intertwined in some way. So I care about what you do and you care about what I do because it influences me in some way and I influence you in some way, is a strategic situation. And so game theory attempts to be a theory that helps us to understand strategic situations like that. At base, it's a mathematical theory, but of course, ideally, one can sort of extract the non-mathematical parts of it, the general lessons, and communicate them beyond that. But as you said, if you want to get way into it, there's a whole lot of sometimes very complex, sometimes not so bad, mathematics behind the theory.
Wow. And how did you first come across it, and when did you get hooked?
I got hooked from a kind of sideways way. I was a philosophy major as an undergraduate in college, mostly interested in logic and other sorts of kind of mathematic-y-ish things going on in philosophy. But I was also playing poker at the time, and I really got interested in thinking about what math can tell you about how to play poker better. And so I started writing, little computer programs to try and figure out how to be a better poker player. I was not a good one, and the computer programs helped a little tiny bit. But as I was talking to one of my professors about what I was doing, I was sort of reinventing some little tiny pieces of game theory, and he said, "Hey, there's this whole area, game theory, that you should learn about, and also it's an area that's relevant to philosophy and science and a lot of the other things that you're interested in." And his name was Bruce Gleamore, and he got me interested in this area, and that just opened that just opened all the doors to me. I got super excited by it. I read a book by a professor who eventually became my PhD supervisor, Brian Skirms, and decided I wanted to go work with him for my PhD, and the rest is history. So it really was poker that got me in, but then discovering that was a little tiny corner of what was this huge world just grabbed me.
How can you paint the picture of what the poker scene was like? Was this like in dorm rooms, or would you like going to illegal spots, or were you out at casinos like trying to
so this was before the big poker boom that happened in the early 2000s. So this was just before it. So it was sort of the stage was being set. I started playing just with friends in my living room in an apartment, for small stakes. And then there was a casino nearby. When I turned 21, I started going to that. It was a Native American casino in Kansas, which is where I grew up. Back then, Texas Hold'em was sort of weird. Nobody knew what it was. And so 7-card stud was the game that everybody was playing. So that's where I started playing. But then the poker boom happened and everybody got excited. And so, then I kept playing in casinos, a little bit online. And when I moved to California, there was a very convenient casino, so I used to play regularly there. And then I also had a game with other game theorists. Every week we would get together and play poker.
Oh, wow.
And that was an intense game. There were some very good poker players and very good game theorists there. But it was a great opportunity to think about, we would stop in the middle and like write equations on the blackboard sometimes to talk through the game theory of the hands, which was, fun in a very nerdy way.
That's hilarious. That's so epic. Yeah, I can really see the difference between the two there. Do you mind me asking, what was I'm not an experienced poker player by any means. One of my friends used to play professionally. He lived in Vegas for, I can't remember, 18 months. Literally rotate, didn't sleep, just Red Bulls and slept during the day. And was just what was your, what was your biggest win and your biggest loss? Or did you keep
Oh, man, that's a good question. I definitely remember a very big loss that was, one of the things that poker teaches you is, you can make the right plays and still lose because it's a game that involves randomness. And this is something game theory also emphasizes is that, it's very important to think about a decision from the point of view of when you're making the decision. So I remember the biggest loss, at least the one that stands out in my head when I was a graduate student, was like a $500 or $600 loss, which, it was a lot to me at the time when I was making probably 24, 25, something like that. But, in graduate school, you're making $15,000 a year trying to make it in Southern California. So that was a lot of money to me. And it was one of those things where, at the moment of making the decision, I had the winning hand. I was making the right decision. But, all the money went into the pot and then the wrong card came out and my opponent won the hand. And, it was frustrating. Of course, you never want to have that happen. But also, you have to, I think one of the things that, game theory and poker both teach you is very important is not to do what the poker players call results-based thinking. So it's to sit down and say, don't think about whether you made the right or wrong decision based on how it turns out. Think about whether you made the right or wrong decision at the moment you made the decision. It's so easy to look back and regret things you did on the basis of what you now know. But of course, hindsight's 20/20, right? There's a reason we say that. And so you always want to put yourself back in the position to make that decision. One of the things I like about the online poker playing strategy community, especially at that time, if you posted a hand that you wanted other people's advice on, they literally would not let you post any information past where you were making your decision. So you would there were these 4 online forums, back in the early 2000s, and you would post the hand, but you had to stop and say, okay, is this the right decision, yes or no? I won't tell you how the hand turns out, because they want to be in the same mind space that you were in at the time. And I think that that's such a super smart way to think about decision making. Wow. Sorry, it was a bit of a tangent. Biggest win, right. I don't know. I don't remember my biggest wins anymore. I only remember the losses. Maybe that just says something about who I am as a person.
Wow, that's crazy. And then once it must have felt pretty good, this professor that you were reading his book, you obviously loved it, and then he became your PhD advisor, or what was the word you used?
Yeah, PhD advisor, supervisor.
Right.
Yeah.
How did that feel? That must be.
That was great. I was so very lucky. I was coming out of, a very good, but not preeminent program at Kansas State University. It was, stronger than I think the reputation of the university, but still, it's not Harvard or Stanford or something like that. And I was applying to this brand new Department of Logic and Philosophy of Science at UC Irvine. And they let me in, and I was super excited because I really, really loved Brian Skirm's work. I was really excited at the prospect of working with him. He was one of very few people working on game theory and philosophy, so I was over the moon about that. And I had a great experience. He was a wonderful advisor. Really, that balance between encouraging you, but also not telling you what to do, pointing you in the right direction, but letting you grow for yourself. And I have nothing but good things to say about my whole experience there.
That's incredible, man. That's incredible. What a good step. How do these two things overlap? Game theory, like philosophy, and then there's science mixed in. Like, can you explain a little bit?
It's a very weird thing. Philosophy, especially a lot of people's picture of philosophy is we sit around and wonder whether we exist or something like that. And some philosophers do that, so it's not totally wrong. But philosophy is a really big field. Once upon a time, everything was called philosophy, physics and math and everything. And so some of us sort of like to hold on to that idea that philosophy is really the fundamental questions about everything, not necessarily just, sitting around wondering if we exist. And so game theory is interesting and fundamental because it's this fundamental theory that gets applied in tons of different scientific fields. So it shows up in biology, it shows up in economics, it shows up in computer science and political science. And it's relevant to everyday life. It's something that matters to playing poker. It matters to making decisions with one's family. It matters to deciding how to run your business. And so it's one of these theories that sort of shows up everywhere. And so this idea of thinking about, game theory is a kind of fundamental way of thinking about the world that applies to almost all the natural world. And so in that way, I think it's very philosophical, even though it doesn't sort of meet what you sort of think of as philosophy when you first hear the word.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really cool hearing your story because you've got this sort of like research-based, approach to it, and then you're out there living it and practicing it like through poker and whatever. And it's like, that's when it's kind of like, okay, is what I think is true when the rubber hits the road, is that actually true?
Yeah.
Did you find any discrepancies between that?
There can be. I mean, one of the things that game theory game theory is a tool. I always describe it as a tool. And so like a tool, it can be helpful or harmful if used in the right or the wrong way. And so one of the major places where, you can get things wrong is if you make the wrong assumptions about the situation you're facing, it will give you radically wrong answers. So, in the early days of game theory, 1940s, 1950s time period, one of the mistakes that a lot of game theorists made is they assumed everything was zero sum. That was the math that was easy for them at the time. That's how they knew how to handle. And so they tried to do zero sum things everywhere. But most things in life aren't zero sum. And so they got a lot of things wrong. And game theory had this bad reputation as being very militaristic and conflictual. And that's true because that's what it was at that time. Because everybody thought it had to be if I gained, somebody else had to lose, or if they gained, I had to lose. And that's just not, there are situations like that, poker's like that, but most situations aren't. And so if you use the wrong, if you describe the situation the wrong way, you're going to end up just getting garbage out. And I think that's usually where I most often find that it makes a mistake is I see that I put the wrong things in.
Yeah, interesting. And could you explain zero sum?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So zero sum is this, win-loss kind of thinking. So the idea is something is zero sum if the only way I can gain is by somebody else losing, and the only way that somebody else can gain is if I lose. So that's the kind of idea that every time there's a gain, there's a loss. Poker's a great example because we all come to the table with our money, and nobody's winning any money that wasn't somebody else's, right? And so as a result, if I win, somebody else has to lose, and if I lose, somebody else must be winning. And so there are real zero-sum things. So it's not like I'm saying they aren't there, but there are a lot of mistakes too. There's a lot of situations that people describe as zero-sum thinking or as zero-sum, which really aren't, because there are opportunities for two people to work together and succeed together, and that's by definition then not zero-sum.
Yeah, and from my lens, something that I've learned from this guy Chris Voss was really great. He talks about the difference between a good sale and a bad sale, or a good deal and a bad deal, is a feeling. And so it's like, if I know that someone bought something before me for $2,000, and then I go to that, have that experience and go buy that product, and I get it pitched to me for $3,000. I'm like, the hell, this is a ripoff. But there's so much context there that's missing of why that might have happened. But if I know I think someone before me got it for $4,000 and I get it offered for $3,000, I'm like, I'm gonna get the best goddamn negotiator on the planet. Could you explain, obviously it's like a spectrum maybe, or
Yeah. I mean, what you're describing there is something that's sometimes called framing effects. So the idea of a framing effect is we feel very differently about an outcome, whether it feels like it's a win to us or whether it feels like it's a loss to us. And so, one like common thing that you'll oftentimes see in sales, but other places, is an attempt to manipulate people's framing effects. So if you remember like the old school kind of almost hackneyed now strategy on the TV channels is saying, you might pay $40 for this, but you can get it now for $20, is an attempt to manipulate that framing effect. Like you try and make people think 40 is the fair price, and so now they're getting it for 20. That feels like a win to them rather than a loss. And that's exactly what you described. If you go in thinking I'm going to pay $2,000 and then you're asked for $3,000, that feels like a loss. Whereas if you go in thinking you're going to pay $4,000 and you pay $3,000, that feels like a win. And there's a lot of research in an area called behavioral economics that is sort of like related to game theory about these kinds of framing effects. When do they happen? When do they not happen? What can you do in order to try and make them? And they're really, really very meaningful because I think that people are influenced by it all the time. I have a conjecture that's what's going on right now. Delta just changed its frequent flyer program in a way that caused like a big kerfuffle. They made it much harder. And as soon as they did that and I read about it, I said to my wife, I'm like, I'll bet you money that they're going to take back some of those changes. But it's easier to like make people think they want to do a terrible thing and then bring it back, and then that bringing it back feels like a win as opposed to just going to where they wanted to. Now I don't have any insider information, but that's my conjecture, because I think that's sometimes people do that when you have to give bad news. You kind of like, well, here's how bad the news could be, but it's not quite as bad. And I think that's all part of the same idea of framing effects, to try and make something feel like a victory when it's really not a victory by framing it in a certain way for people.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, and then so we have zero-sum game, and then there's mutually beneficial. If we were to put those two next to each other, those are kind of opposites.
Yeah, exactly. So if a situation can be mutually beneficial, then it's definitely not zero sum. So if there's any opportunity for a win-win solution of a kind, then it can't be zero sum, because zero sum has to be win and loss.
Okay, got it. And then, because I'm thinking this similar vein of something can be mutually beneficial, kind of like 90-10, or it can be 50-50. Would you be able to paint us an example so we can see that in real life?
Absolutely. So there are a lot of situations where things can be mutually beneficial, but also unequal in certain ways. And that's, I think, exactly the most complicated types of situations. So like at one extreme, you have zero sum. At another extreme, you have just like perfect win-win, like everybody wins in exactly the same degree. But reality really lives somewhere in the middle, where we can win, but it might be that you win a little bit more than I win. So one of the classic stories that game theory tells is this game called Bach or Stravinsky, or the more sort of less politically correct old version of it was Battle of the Sexes. And the idea there was you got a couple who wants to go see either Bach or Stravinsky. Both are playing in the same night, and they have to decide which one to go to. Now, worst case scenario is that they get in a fight and they stay home. So that's bad for both of them. They don't want to do that. So it's not zero sum, because the worst outcome would be bad for both of them. It would be lose-lose. But they do have to argue, do you go to Bach that one of them wants to go to, or do you go to Stravinsky that the other one wants to go to? And now you have this situation of there's no equitable solution. You either go to one person's favorite or you go to the other person's favorite. So it's not a zero-sum game, because you could end up both losing, but it's also a situation that feels conflictual, because it's one person can get what they want or the other person can get what they want. And so there are a lot, I think reality really looks a lot like that. There are opportunities for win-win, but the win-win is not always perfectly symmetric or perfectly equal.
Okay, got it. And is that what you would call the prisoner's dilemma?
No, in the prisoner's dilemma, it's related in that the prisoner's dilemma is also not zero sum, but in game theory terminology, Battle of the Sexes is called a coordination game, and prisoner's dilemma is it's called a social dilemma. The problem with the prisoner's dilemma is that well, let me give you the story first, and then I'll talk about it. So the story of the prisoner's dilemma is you got two criminals, they both get arrested, the cops are certain, absolutely can convict them of a relatively minor crime, theft or something like that. But the cops suspect that they're guilty of a much more serious crime, something like murder. And so they do the thing that they do on every cop show that you've ever seen. They take the two prisoners, they put them into two different rooms, and they say to each of them, here's the deal. You can either stay silent about the murder, not say anything, or you can confess. If you stay silent, you're going to jail for theft. We've got you dead to rights, no problem. If you confess, we'll let you off on the theft charge, no matter what. Right? So that's for good behavior. If you confess and the other dude stays silent, well, then we'll need your testimony against him and you get off scot-free. But if you both confess, well, we don't need your testimony anymore, so you're both going to jail for murder. Right. Mm-hmm. So that's the situation. And if it feels familiar, it's because it is. It's like Law and Order uses it. Every crime procedural has used some version of the prisoner's dilemma. The thing that makes it a dilemma is that each prisoner can reason as follows. Well, look, if the other guy stays silent and I confess, perfect, right? I get off for theft and I get off for murder. I go scot-free. That's wonderful. If the other guy stays silent, well then, I already said that. If the other guy stays silent, I should confess because I can get off scot-free. If the other guy confesses, well, I'm still better off confessing because I'm going to jail for murder no matter what, but at least I could get off for the theft charge. At least I'll get a little bit of time off for the theft charge. So no matter what the other guy does, I do better by confessing, so I confess. But then the other guy reasons the same way, and we both end up going to jail for murder, whereas if we had just kept our trap shut, we would have only gone to jail for theft. So that's the prisoner's dilemma. And the reason that it's sometimes called a dilemma or a paradox occasionally is that it looks like by following their self-interest, they both made themselves worse off than they would have been if they didn't follow their self-interest. And what's going on here is that there's a conflict between what's good for the pair of them, but what's good for each person individually. Mm-hmm. And there are lots of examples of this. So, people talk about like pollution as an example for this, right? So, yeah, I recognize that maybe I shouldn't drive my car to work because it will cause pollution that will ultimately lead to climate change. But the benefit to me of driving far outweighs the tiny impact that my car would have on the environment, so I do it. And then everyone does it, and then we end up with a worse environment. Or, if you go to a restaurant with a bunch of friends and you just pass around the check and say, throw in whatever, you think you owe, each person can think, well, if I just shave a few dollars off, nobody will notice. And then if everybody does it, all of a sudden you're super short, right? So there are lots and lots and lots of circumstances where like what's in the interest of the private individual leads the group to do something that's bad for the group as a whole. And the prisoner's dilemma is like a cute little story that really illustrates this, I think, a very common phenomena where self-interest leads everybody to do something that ends up making everybody worse off.
Yeah, man, this is so wild because I've been thinking a lot as I get older of just like kind of the way I saw the world when I was younger versus how I see it today is I'm like, wow, everyone is just really operating from their self-interest. Mm-hmm. And so it pushes me towards being like, well, I'm actually losing by thinking and caring more about the whole. Mm-hmm. And ultimately, I'm going to end up in a shit position. So I'd better say, fuck it, and just take care of myself. And it's like everyone seems like that's the conclusion that everyone would reach.
Exactly. And that's exactly what's the problem of social dilemmas. And so one huge area of research that game theorists focus on is what can we do to change that situation? It's not enough to go to people and like wag your finger at them and say you ought not be selfish, because exactly what you're saying, the person says, wait, what? But if I by myself act in a non-selfish way, I'll end up being worse off. And that's, the prisoner's story is like that. Look, the prisoner says, wait, if I just stay silent, then I end up going to jail for theft at least, and potentially for everything. So why should I not follow my own self-interest? And so what game theory has tried to do is think about how do you take a social dilemma and do something to change it, to make it so that self-interest and what's good for the group all point in the same direction. And there are lots of different solutions that have been suggested. People have done historical research to look at various ways that this problem has been solved. Eleanor Ostrom, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics several years ago, is famous for like digging through history, trying to find these and find different ways that they were solved. And so there's a lot of, mathematical, historical, cultural research that's been done to try and figure out how we can solve these problems so that people can put them to use when they come across them. Like trivial things like when you're going out to dinner with friends, but also big things like trying to figure out how to solve global crises like war and climate change and all of these different problems.
Okay, we're going to go hard left here. I'm going to try and bring something in that I've been thinking about.
Sure, no problem.
So would you mind just picking this up? I'm going to throw an idea and hopefully you can pick it up and go somewhere. Ancient Greece, okay, back in the day, you had the giant pot. And once a year, you could put, once a year, everyone put at least 6,000 pieces of broken pottery with someone's name on it, they would exile them.
Okay.
And it seems like that really helped to hold up a very strong, I guess, this idea that they had about democracy coming into fruition. And by having these very strict rules, it was like nobody was able to rise above and be a tyrant. Could you explain a little bit, maybe from a game theorist perspective on that and how they maintained this idea that has come to fruition thousands of years later and remained?
Yeah, and this is an idea that looks like it was pretty central to the way humans evolved to cooperate around the globe. So there's lots of evidence of variations on this kind of theme. And the basic idea was that it helps us to solve people being It helps us to create a circumstance where people's self-interest and the group interest become aligned with one another. Because now, if I'm too selfish and too much of a jerk to everyone else, now I run the risk that eventually I just get kicked out. So I lose all the benefits of being in a society, the military protection of others, the cooperation and division of labor that I could get, the assistance of a government if there's a government, all of those things. And so when I'm confronted with one of those situations where it's like I could do something that benefits me but harms everybody else, now I just don't have to think about this one little circumstance, whether it's good or bad. I have to think about, well, but is it worth doing if I run the risk of being excluded from society entirely, right? And so these kinds of rules of creating private clubs of a form, basically, are a long-standing solution to forcing cooperation. And we, in a certain sense, do the same thing today, right? If you act in certain kinds of selfish ways that hurt other people, you go to jail, right? So if you steal something from somebody or you engage in insider trading or whatever, if you do something that's bad, we don't like throw you out in the way the ancient Greeks would just like throw you into the woods, but we don't let you get the benefits of participating in society anymore. And so this is one of the tricks that people use to try and mold people's self-interest so that they no longer have an incentive to act in ways that hurt society.
Okay, cool. So another personal experience, I'd love to get some thoughts on this. So I've been involved in men's groups very consistently since I was like 21ish, and kind of like there's standards. It's like you show up every week unless there are extenuating circumstances, like you're sick or you're out of town, but you show up. You show up on time, and it's like if you continue not to show up and you're not contributing or not even showing up, then you get 3 strikes and you're out. So that's based on what you said, that allows there to be more of a self-interest to group interest alignment. What happens when the rules become more lax and the standards aren't upheld? From your perspective, what happens to, I guess, the integrity of the group, or what happens to that group structure? Is there a bigger gap that happens, or?
Yeah, exactly. And so, that's a great example of a rule that sort of lives in between very draconian rules. Your group could have had the rule, you're late once, you're out, right? 1 strike and you're out, right? Or it could have had very lax rules like, well, if you're late every time for 6 years, then we'll kick you out or something, and the reason that, you want it, why would you want one versus the other? Well, on the draconian side, the great thing about the draconian rule is that it enforces conduct, right? If we say, if you're late even once, we're definitely kicking you out. And so as a result, everybody has a really strong incentive to try and be on time. Except, we all know there are always circumstances that are beyond our control. You're perfectly on time, but you get in a car accident on the way, or you get a flat tire, or whatever. And so very draconian rules can actually backfire, because then people won't even try and follow them, because they know that they're going to end up breaking it through no fault of their own. And so you end up creating a circumstance where nobody even tries and nobody even bothers, right? So if you create a standard that's unattainable, and then you say, if you don't achieve this standard, we'll punish you, then people will just say, well, to hell with it. I don't want to do that, right? On the other hand, if you create standards that are too lax, well, now you let people start to game it. People can say, well, it's fine. I can be late today because I've got 800 strikes still. And so then the rules, people can start acting in selfish ways that harm the group, and they know that they can get away with it. They can game it and figure out exactly how often they can be late or whatever. So it's going to be different in different circumstances, but finding that balance between rules that are not so draconian that they're worth living up to and that we're trying to live up to, but also aren't so lax that you create a circumstance where everybody sort of feels free to just flout them and not follow them. That's the balance. And depends on the circumstances of the individual group whether 3 strikes is the right number. I mean, because of baseball, somehow everyone thinks that must be the right number, but figuring out like what's that right balance. And there's actually this is one of those things where, boy, if you want to nerd out on the math, there's a ton that shows, given certain assumptions about how often people make mistakes and all of that, exactly how many strikes basically do you want to have? And there's a whole theory behind exactly these kinds of questions.
Do you have a number that I could take back to the group and say we're changing from 3 to 5? Or?
3 to 5. I mean, the big question basically is, how often do you think a person who's acting in good faith would end up making the mistake? Right. And so, if you think about it, think about like how often do you get a flat tire, how often do you end up in a car accident, or whatever it is given the circumstance, and say, okay, on average, maybe you'll be late once a year or something along those lines. You don't want to then say it's 1 strike. The problem of putting it right at the average is every once in a while somebody's going to get unlucky and get 2 flats in a year or whatever. Yeah. So you always want to move it and be a little bit more liberal, So kind of thinking about like what would you expect the average person who's acting in good faith to do, and then give them some leeway. So if it's if it's 1 flat tire a year, 3 strikes a year might be a pretty good rule to follow. If it's 2 flat tires a year, then maybe something more like 4 or 6 or something like that. But trying always, never create a rule that's right at that average, because just like in poker, you can end up getting unlucky.
Yeah, and it just seems, from witnessing my own behavior in these environments and other people's behavior, it seems almost like human nature to push against those boundaries and make excuses for ourselves and not want to, unless there are clear directives. It's why? I guess, where does that come from? Why do we want to do that? Do you know?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, one of the things that my colleagues here at Carnegie Mellon, Linda Babcock and George Lowenstein, have studied is situations where we tend to be biased in favor of ourselves. So we tend to look at a circumstance and think that we're unusual or special in a certain way because we know ourselves and we think of ourselves as being, good people overall. And so if something goes wrong, we tend to focus on the ways in which it was outside of our control. And of course, sometimes that's true, right? Sometimes bad things happen that are outside of our control. But we also tend to minimize the ways in which we do have control over it. So, I'm a professor. I see this a lot with my students. They'll come to me and they'll say, I missed 6 classes during the semester, but I was sick, for 2 of them. And I'll say, well, yeah, okay, you were sick for 2 of them, but what about the other 4? Right? And they're like, okay, yeah, I just overslept or whatever, And so that's one of those situations where we tend to focus on the things that put ourselves in a good light because we like ourselves. And so we have this narrative about ourselves as good people. And so we tend to focus on the ways that, that we do things wrong. This is part of the reason, or we tend to focus on not on the ways that we've done things wrong. this is part of the reason why creating these rules can be really helpful, because those self-serving biases provide us an opportunity to act in selfish ways, but that we don't always think of as selfish. So if I ask you, like, are you a selfish person? Most people are going to say no, right? And it's true, actually. I think lots of people aren't selfish in lots of really important ways, but they also don't always see the ways in which they are selfish. What a rule like that forces you to confront is now, like, wait a minute, if I want to argue that I get an exception to the rule, I have to justify to somebody else not just why I was late one time, but rather why I was late 3 times and why all 3 times weren't my fault or something like that.
Yeah. It's never my fault.
Never my fault, right? I mean, look, this is one of those things. Whenever I teach these things, I always lead with stories about where I do it to myself, because I think, look, we should try and overcome these biases. We should think about them, but also they're very human, and so it's not like I'm perfect. Far from it.
Yeah, I agree. Same. So, what's the difference between a finite game and an infinite game?
Oh, good. Yeah. This is one of those things that game theorists like to use. Weirdly, infinite can sometimes be mathematically easier, which sounds almost like a paradox, but nobody cares why, but it turns out that it's why. There are a couple of ways that games can be infinite, and one of the classic ones is to think about playing a game with the same person over and over and over an infinite number of times. So, nobody actually wants to play tic-tac-toe an infinite number of times or something like that, but the idea is that it's a nice way to think about relationships that can continue over time, right? So while it's true I'm never going to play an infinite game because I won't live forever, it's also the case that for any given day, I have reason to think that probably there'll be a tomorrow and that we'll play again tomorrow. And so, if of course, someday I'll retire, but that's a long ways off, and I don't even quite know when it's going to be. And so every day I come to work, I know that whatever games I'm playing with my colleagues today, I'll probably play with them tomorrow. And so infinite games are kind of like a simplification or an easy way to think about that. Like, well, just imagine that the game goes on forever, and think about how you'll play today and how that will influence tomorrow. So it's, of course, a little imperfect, but it turns out to be a very useful sort of cartoon way of thinking about how we do things.
And how because I imagine philosophy influenced your thinking about infinite and finite games quite a bit. It's part of, like, if you think of Stoicism, it's like nothing's infinite, everything's finite. So could you expand on that, maybe?
Absolutely, yeah. So that's why I described it the way I did, because it's like it's what we call an idealization. So what that means is it's taking the real world and making a little bit of a kind of false or untrue assumption, but that actually helps us to think about it. And it's something we do all the time, right? I never understand another person, especially somebody who I don't know very well, in the full detail of their lives, but rather I kind of sketch, oh yeah, this person is a salesperson, so that must be they're this kind of person, right? Of course, they're way more complex than that, but if I'm just buying something from them, that idealized version of them is something that I can interact with. There's a story by the famous author Borges, where he sort of makes fun of a king who wants a full-scale map of the country. So that is literally a map that is exactly as big as the country. And it's like, that's useless, right? What could you possibly do? And that's an analogy that I like to use here. It's like you always have to simplify. Maps simplify. Google Maps simplifies, or whatever. And so when we think about infinite games, it's just the reality is I have to think about, well, how likely is it that I'm going to live until tomorrow, and how likely is it that I won't quit my job before tomorrow, and that my colleague won't get hit by a bus or won't quit their job, Ugh, that's just such a pain, and it's not really worth the trouble. So I'll just say, I'm going to treat this like it's going to go on forever, and that's a simplification. And so you're exactly right. I'm with the Stoics here. Nothing's infinite. Everything's finite. But we can treat it like it's infinite, because that just makes our reasoning simpler. It means that I'll treat it like it'll go on forever, and then maybe I'll worry about the details when I'm 90 and know that it won't.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. Like, to riff on the Stoicism thing of, like, realizing that you're a speck in infinity. It's like there's this concept of infinity that makes you realize how small you are. So it's like those two things opposing each other, like you said. Well, I mean, one thing that's always really tricky here is, like, infinity as a mathematical concept is
bigger and more confusing than you could ever possibly imagine, and so something can be finite but big, and I think that's, we don't know. I guess the universe could be infinite. I think physicists think it's probably finite, but it's really, really, really big. And so treating it like it's infinite, especially when, thinking about yourself as your relationship to the universe is pretty close to a bit to an infinite, even though, like, technically speaking, and it's really finite, but just gazillions and gazillions of times bigger than you can imagine.
Yeah, well, how has that influenced how you live your life? Kind of like, realizing how big things are.
Yeah, I mean, I'm of the opinion that I think it's important to both remember how small one is, but also remember how important one is in a very small microcosm. I can only influence the world in a very small way, but in that small way that I can definitely do better and worse things and affect the world in better and worse ways. And so I always try to, it's hard to maintain both thoughts at the same time, but to maintain both thoughts at the same time, like, at the end of the day, the world is going to be that much different based on me being here, but I also have the choice between whether it's going to be that much better or that much worse. And so, that's the way I sort of think about it.
Would you have any suggestions for someone who's, like myself, just exploring this and go, okay, how do I use this in my life? Like, what's maybe an initial lens of game theory that I can put over the way I see the world, so then I can go and, maybe influence my environment?
Absolutely. The first thing I always recommend to people is to start thinking like a game theorist. And so rather than taking a single result or a single game or a single story and trying to do something with it, just think about your social world in the way that a game theorist would. A game theorist always breaks down any kind of social interaction into three parts. Who are the players? And what that means is, who are the relevant people? Who are the people who have actions that they could take that might influence this circumstance? So say you're going to buy a car from a car dealer. Obviously, two of the relevant players are you, the buyer, and the salesperson that you're interacting with. Probably also a supervisor or some manager who also maybe has to sign off on the deal. So there might be two or three players. And you can sort of think about it as a game between just those three people, right? Of course, in theory, there are other people that care, but you sort of, okay, these are the people who really have decisions to make and whose decisions might influence what the outcome is going to be. All right, that's step one. Who are the players? Step two, what are their strategies, or what options do they have available to them, right? So I can offer to pay a lot of money, in theory, for a car, but obviously I can't pay more money than I have, right? Or I can't offer to pay more than I could get a loan for, or something like that. So my strategies are constrained by how much money I have. So there are certain things that I might do which aren't an option to me, right? The salesperson can't, despite what they might occasionally say, sell it to you at a loss, right? That's just not something that is going to be a possibility for them because they're in business, right? And so there's some, you may not know what it is, but there's some floor below which they just will not sell you the car below that because it would be cheaper for them to keep the car. And so going through that, what are the strategies of the various players? And so that's step two. And step three, which is the hardest one, but also the most critical one, is think about what do people want out of the interaction. The car salesperson thing is I use that because it's simpler. Because in this situation, mostly what people want is financial, right? I want to get a new car, but for the cheapest I possibly can. The salesperson wants to sell me the car, but would like to sell it for the most they possibly can. But there are already some wrinkles, right? It's not just that I want to buy a car, but also I want it to be treated with respect. And I might be willing to pay a little bit more if I feel like I'm being treated honestly or kindly or with respect. And presumably the same thing is true of the salesperson, right? Salesperson, if I'm a real pain in the ass, might be like, I'd rather just not deal with this person. I'm not gonna give them a discount because they're a jerk. Salesperson might also be interested in things like repeat business, so you might be able to use that to your advantage or something like that. But sitting and thinking through what people want. And the reason I say this is the hardest part is because it's so easy to stop at the surface, right? It's so easy to say in the sales interaction, yeah, they just want to make the most they can, and I want to get it for the cheapest I can, end of story. And it's true, that's a big part of it, but that's not the end of story, because I definitely have chosen not to buy from somebody and paid more by going to a different business because they're nice to me rather than somebody who's a jerk. And so where a lot of people make mistakes at this step, especially, is by stopping at that surface level and not thinking deeper about what are all the motivations that a person has, not just the financial or the obvious ones. They don't think about the deeper
Yeah, well,
ones.
that's amazing. Do you have any ways that you have anchored this in your life? Because sometimes I find like it's the practice and repeating of taking the time to sit and go, okay, 1, 2, 3, before I go into an interaction, the preparation that actually ingrains it in my life versus being like, okay, cool, I wrote 1, 2, 3, and then I'll go and just do the same thing for the rest of my life.
Yeah. I do this all the time, especially at work when I'm going to interact with a colleague where I know there's going to be a little bit of conflict, where I know they want one thing and I want something else. And, this is a circumstance where if they're not...
They're like, oh no, here comes the game theory guy.
Yeah, exactly right. They don't... Yeah, sometimes they don't let me come into the meetings because of this, but, well, maybe that's a win for me too. So, but, this is a situation where if they're not, especially at a university, it's a little less structured than at a lot of corporations. Like, there are a lot of people that I have to, like, get on board with something, and I'm not their boss and they're not my boss. And so it's much more almost democratic in a certain respect. And so I have to go into this and I think, okay, well, I want this thing and they want something else. It looks like we're going to have a conflict. Let me figure out, what are they interested in? Why is it that they want the thing that they want? And that can sometimes be really hard. I mean, you can say what they want, like, okay, my colleague wants, to admit more graduate students to work with them, and I want to admit more graduate students to work with me, but we've got a budget, so we can't, But that sounds too simple. Now I have to say, well, why do they want graduate students to work with them? What's the thing that they're looking for? What is motivating them? And I have to think about that. And this is one of the things that professional negotiators, they may not necessarily always study game theory, but they learn it on the job. The critical thing is to not stop at the first line demands, but say, why is it you want that? What is it about that gives you value? Because that's where you can start to find those win-win solutions, by figuring out what it is that motivates people. And so that's, I do try. I mean, I don't, I've done it so much, I'm not necessarily doing like step 1, step 2, step 3 anymore, but I always try to go in thinking about like, okay, what is this? And then when people behave in ways that seem inconsistent to me, the first thing I do is stop and say, wait, was I wrong? Are they motivated by something else? And I think that's also really important, is to have that constantly redoing this process, because you can be wrong, and then you can, like I said, garbage in, garbage out with game theory. You can really screw things up. And so stop and be like, wait, maybe I've got them wrong. Maybe this car salesman is about to quit his job, and so he doesn't care about money, right? He just wants to be done with me so that he can, retire or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have a couple of questions that you ask in those moments? Because those can be tough moments when you're kind of going in with a theory or an idea, and then all of a sudden you're like, oh, it's completely, like Mike Tyson's line. It's like everyone's got a plan until they get punched in the face.
Yes,
right?
Exactly. And I always try to, one thing that I think is just really, really critical is, and I'm imperfect at this, let me tell you, but it's to have that emotional like detachment, so that you can, like, when you're in the moment, it's very easy to be like convinced of your own theory and convinced of the irrationality of the other person. It's very easy to be like, that person's behaving like an idiot. And look, sometimes people are idiots. I mean, I'm not going to tell you they're not. But people are idiots less often than you think. And so I always try and stop myself. Like, when my first call is like, that person's an idiot, or that person's irrational, or that person's stupid, is to stop and go, wait, is it that they're really stupid, or is it that I don't understand what it is they're going for? And they may not even understand themselves, but so whenever I start to say that person's being irrational, I always try to stop myself and say, wait, it might be. That's a real possibility, but don't make it your first answer. Make sure that you're right about everything else before you decide that that's the explanation.
And in that moment, do you have any kind of back pocket questions you ask to get clarity around that?
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that I always try and do is I try and think, what could they be interested in that would make sense of their behavior? So philosophers call this the principle of charity. So the idea is, and not charity like as in giving money, but like as being a charitable thinker or something like that. So the idea is, stop and say, okay, I've just watched this person like refuse a bunch of deals or do a bunch of things or whatever, and I say, boy, it sure looks like they're behaving irrationally. Let me stop and say, what could they want that would make sense of what they did? So how can I like science fiction-y sort of like what could be going on here? And then oftentimes I'll come up with more than one option. So like, well, maybe it's this, maybe it's that, maybe it's this other thing. And then, but once I have a set, then I can start doing experiments. If they're the kind of person that's interested in communicating with me and is going to be honest with me, I can say, hey, wait, it sounds like maybe you're interested in this. Is it this? Or it sounds like you're interested in A or B. If sometimes they're not, they don't want to tell you, or they're just too angry to have that conversation or something. And then in those situations, you can do little experiments, right? You can say, well, if what they really want is this, if I make this offer to them, they'll take it. And so you can sort of, test the waters a little bit by saying, well, could I give you this? So like, I mean, I'm sure that you're probably already familiar with this. Somebody who has background in sales like you will know these things about like, well, maybe you could say, well, hey, do you want this thing? Would you be interested in, this deal, this contract, this particular kind of car or something like that? And if the person goes, well, yeah, I might be, now you know something. Now you know whether they care about, that kind of a feature of the thing you're selling. And then if they go, oh no, I'm not interested. Now, you've got something figured out. They're not interested in that. That strategy that you might use in sales, you can use in everything, because you can figure out when when your partner's mad at you about something and you're not sure why, you can start to try and figure out, well, wait, what's the thing that they're interested in? What's the, is it that they feel like they've been treated badly by me? Is it that they just want a day off and they want me to take over the household chores? Or what is it, And they may not know themselves always, but these little experiments can sometimes help you to figure it out.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's the thing that changed a lot for me, is actually having structure. And realizing that conversation has structure and a process, and it allows you to, instead of sitting in this big mass of confusion and guessing, you're able to shave off the edges.
Yeah.
And, love that line where you're like, you can kind of label it in a way. Oh, it sounds like blah.
Yeah.
And being okay with them saying no.
Yeah.
Because you don't need a yes. You just, what that does is it just shaves it off. Like you said, experimenting, you just keep going via negativa to get the answer that maybe they don't even know how to articulate.
Yeah. And that's, I think, super important. At times like, for instance, I've dealt with customer service people where something goes wrong, like a flight gets canceled or the product breaks or something like that.
Delta.
Yeah, right. Right. You call them on the phone, and the good people, the people who are really well trained and I think are really good at their job, the first thing they start to do is they start to say, okay, what is it about this circumstance that's bad? Is it that you're mad because you're going to miss a meeting? Okay, well, if that's the problem, let's figure out how we can get you to your meeting as fast as possible. Is it you're mad because your bag is going to get separated from you because you need something in your bag? Well, how can we get you the thing that you would need, like give you a free toothbrush or something like that? And I mean, they face all sorts of crazy constraints and they can't always do it. But good ones are we'll start to ask those questions like, okay, what's the thing that you're mad about, and how can I get to that thing that you're mad about and solve that problem, rather than try and solve all problems all at once, which they can't possibly do. Figure out, is this the kind of person that's mad because of a meeting? Are they mad because they feel mistreated? Are they mad because they got separated from their toothbrush? Are they mad because they don't have a place to stay? And figure out, can I address the thing that they're mad about? And that's very much game theory thinking. And one of the things that I think is great about game theory is it shows that like this thing that works in customer service or sales or something is not just a sales strategy or a customer service strategy, but it's a strategy that works for everything, and it's a way of thinking that works for everything.
Yeah, I'm really loving how you're explaining this, and I think this beautiful merge, like you said, of philosophy and game theory. Of it's like we're taking these concepts and structures of game theory and then being like, okay, and then there's people, which are messy and they're not always rational, and all of a sudden they'll explode about something, and it's like, how do you have these structures that help you to kind of navigate this to the best possible outcome?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, cool. So let's dive into that, because you wrote this book about parenting, the Game Theorist's Guide to Parenting, and I'd love to. Maybe you could just give a little bit of summary of the book, and then I'll ask some questions after that.
Yeah, so the book is I think lighthearted. We try to make it approachable because game theory can be kind of intimidating, as can parenting for that matter. And but the idea is to try and use some of the lessons from game theory to try and think about common situations that parents and children, or even parents of children, but interacting with co-parents, partners, those sorts of things, might be confronting. So each chapter is sort of built around a vignette, either from my co-author who has kids. I don't have kids, as it turns out. So the vignettes are all from my childhood and the ways in which I was a pain to my parents. Vignettes of those sorts of things, like kid is lying. What can you do about that? Or two siblings are fighting over a toy. What can you do about that? Or there's a disagreement about where the family is going to go on vacation. What can you do about that? So sort of starting with these vignettes and then describing a little bit of how would a game theorist approach this problem? What is the game theory solutions or what is it that game theory suggests one should do in that situation? And how can it work for a parent? And one of the things that, to connect with what I was just saying that I love about the book is, even though I'm not a parent, as soon as my co-author started bringing parenting problems to me, I was like, oh yeah, I know that. Even though I haven't dealt with it with a kid, I've dealt with it I've dealt with an analogous situation. I can see those connections that maybe he couldn't see, and so I could bring a bit of game theory to it. And that's how we sort of wrote the book. Is he would give me a problem, I would see if there was some relevant game theory, and then we'd put a chapter together that was sort of his expertise on parenting and my expertise on game theory. How could our dialogue with one another help him be a better parent, but also how can the parenting situation help us think about our lives in general, more like the way a game theorist does.
What did you learn about dealing with adults by writing a book geared towards parents and children?
One thing that surprised me is kids are way smarter than I think they often are given credit for. Like, the question that everybody always asks me is like, well, game theory assumes that everybody's behaving rationally, and kids don't behave rationally. And then when I would start to talk to Paul Rayburn, my co-author, he'd be like, well, yeah, I mean, they don't behave rationally in some respects, but also they're not worried about much. So if they want something out of you, they're spending 100% of their mental energy trying to figure out how to get that. And so even though they may be not quite as smart as adults are because their brains are still developing and they're still learning, 100% of a kid's brain working on a problem versus, the 4% of a time that a parent has to dedicate to it. Kids are oftentimes outsmarting parents. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of those things that it really made me think like, yeah, I shouldn't presume that other people are dumb or irrational or something like that, because even a 5-year-old can outsmart their parents. Like, just assuming that somebody else is not smart enough to outsmart me is probably the wrong way to think about it. So I don't know. That's one of the things that I took away from working on this, was that like, people, especially if they have real strong incentives, can be really smart, even if they're maybe not super well educated, or they're like with kids, their brains haven't fully developed, and so don't always presume that you can outsmart somebody just because you think you're smarter than them.
Yeah, definitely. There was a part in the book that I really loved, which was about when you have two siblings. So I had a younger brother, and let's say you get a video game console, and there's one controller.
Yeah.
Who gets it first?
Yeah.
And what is fair? Could you expand on that? And
yeah.
how you figured that out?
Fairness is one of these really tricky problems. And in fact, that exact example connects with the story of Bach and Stravinsky that we talked about earlier. So now there's a good here, being the first person to play the game. The problem is, it's not a good that you can cut in half. Right? You can't do Solomon's baby solution and cut the video game machine in half and give each kid half of it, right? So you have to figure out, how do you allocate this in a way that feels fair, even though at the end of the day there's always going to be a winner and a loser. So the first and obvious one is maybe you flip a coin, and that feels fair in the beginning, but then once the coin comes out, it doesn't feel fair anymore because somebody wins and somebody loses, right? And so one of the ways that we talk about this, which is one of these only an economist could think of this solution, is think about it like an auction, right? You have this good that you're selling in a certain sense to one of the kids. So now you ask them, well, what would you be willing to pay? Now with kids, of course, I don't think you should use money necessarily for this because, kids' concept of money is still a little weird. It's still developing. But you can use other things like, well, okay, Timmy, would you be willing to do a chore, one of Johnny's chores, in order to be able to play first? And then maybe he says, yes, I'll do one. Okay, well, now, Johnny, would you be willing to do two of Timmy's chores in order to get first, right? And you go back and forth, and you go back and forth. And then eventually you end up with a situation where the person who wants it more is willing to pay more in order to get it. And the other one says, oh, thank God, like, I'm not getting to play the video game first, but also I'm not going to have to do 17 chores. And so then that can make it feel more fair because you're giving it to the person, in a sense, who wants it more, but you're charging them a fee. And if you make that fee benefit the other one, so like Timmy is doing Johnny's chores, well, now the loser feels great about it because the loser's like, perfect, now I'm getting out of chores. So he wins the video game and I win getting out of chores. And so that's a way that you can take what feels like a win-loss kind of zero-sum situation, and you can turn it into a win-win situation by introducing an extra dimension of things that people can feel good about.
Amazing. Yeah, it's actually, like, without knowing this concept, it's that what you're talking about has been one of the most beneficial things in my relationship with my partner, is that when we somehow organically ended up there, of like, if I want to do something and she doesn't, like we're talking about where we're living right now, it's like, I don't like living in cities. I hate it. Right? Very much like I'm from the country, and like, whereas we're living like downtown Medellin right now. And it's like, there's like 4 million people here. I'm like, this is chaos. But it's like, we negotiated around, okay, well, like, we lived in the middle of Nicaragua for the last 9 months, in the middle of nowhere, like the power's cutting out all the time, internet's cutting out. And so it was like, okay, I'm going to do this, and then we'll do that. And then after this, and it's like kind of mapping out this timeline of our lives. And it also gave us more certainty about what we're doing in the future and what is fair to the other person. And now I'm here going, okay, cool, I can deal with this, instead of pulling my hair out for 9 months and being like, I hate it. It's because there's a payoff. And
there's
also for Bianca is like,
exactly. And so you have that experience of like, here's this other thing. Another thing that we talk about in the book, which sounds like maybe that is what the two of you did, is a strategy that's super familiar to parents from like food, but they don't realize how general it is. The strategy called I cut, you pick. So this is one of those situations where, like, if you have like a piece of cake that you want two kids to share, you have one of them cut it in half, and then the other one gets to choose which piece they want. That creates an incentive for the first one to cut it into equal sized or fair amounts, because they know if one piece is much bigger than the other one, well, guess what? The other guy's going to pick the bigger piece, right? So you can do that with everything, though. So, like, for instance, in your example, it sounds like you've sort of done that with time, right? So it's like, okay, now we've got to decide we're going to live in, one place for so many months and somewhere else for so many months, or for so many years and so many years. So we made that agreement. Somebody cut time, first 5 years here, second 5 years here. And then somebody else gets to choose, okay, well, which one do I want? Do I want to live in the city first and then the country second, or the country first and the city second, or something like that? Or if it's not that, you say, well, maybe I get to choose whether it's a city or a rural area, and you get to choose which city or which rural area it is, or something like that. So there are variations on this theme. But this idea of asking one person to create two options and then asking the other person to choose which one creates really strong incentives for the first person to come up with two fair options, because they always know that if one of them's better and the other one's worse, that the other one's going to choose the better one.
Wow, I love that. I wrote it down, highlighted it in green, put a big circle around it. I cut, you pick. That's great.
I cut, you pick. It's a great strategy. And there's one of these things, like the nerd out math, there's a ton of math that shows that it's like optimal in all of these different cool ways, and that it's really perfect to do a lot of things. But it only works for two people. That's the tricky thing. Once you get three, there are versions of I cut, you pick, but they get really complicated. So, but with two people, they're perfect. It's absolutely perfect.
Perfect. Okay. We're going to bring the philosophy into something that you were talking about here, and fate, the coin toss, and thinking about like our lack of religion or faith in gods and all that sort of stuff. Because I imagine we'll use the same time period as when we're talking about the ancient Greeks. If there was a video game back there, or someone got a smooth rock, like flipping the coin, and the faith that I had in that it was up to the gods, I probably would have felt better about it, because you didn't curse the gods for luck. You were like, it's kind of how it is. Could you expand on that? Maybe like the mindset difference then versus today, and maybe the benefits of having faith.
Yeah, I mean, it's really a complicated. Randomness is one of these really complicated ideas because it's one of those things that our brains are just not good at. We're not good about thinking about randomness. One of the favorite stories that I like to tell is if you ask somebody, write down what seems like a random sequence of like heads and tails of a coin toss. What they'll actually write down is not very random. It will actually switch too often. So it won't have long runs. It'll be like heads, tails, maybe heads, tails, something like that. Whereas real coin tosses, you might get 5 heads in a row. So we're really bad about thinking about randomness, and we're really prone to find patterns where they don't exist. And so that's exactly why, like, the ancient Greeks thought, like, all of this is determined by the gods, because they started to think they were finding patterns, like, oh, any time that I'm mean to somebody else, then my crops get extra bugs, and so that must mean that there's some god that's punishing me for it. And look, I mean, maybe there is. I'm not here to to shit on anyone's religion, but we're really good at finding patterns even where they aren't there. Go to the casino and you'll find a million people who are like, oh yeah, 17 always comes up after you see 18 3 times before or whatever. That's just how our brains are wired. And so one of the things that I think one has to be really careful about, I think, is it can feel good to find those patterns. Just like you say, like it feels a lot better when, you lose something because of some randomness and you say, well, it was up to the gods. The gods made the decision. That makes you feel better. But also, sometimes attributing those patterns, I think, can be really destructive because then you start to think that, like, well, if I just bring a rabbit's foot with me to the casino, then I'll win. And probably my guess is that there's no connection between the rabbit's foot. It's my professional opinion as a game theorist. And so, that's one of those things where I think that we always have to be careful about attributing too much structure to randomness because it can really mislead us. On the other hand, I mean, it can be fun. I mean, I know all this stuff and yet still I joke around about, like, well, I'm due to win, or it's, I'm running hot today, or things like that. But I always try to keep in the back of my mind that it's sort of a fun thing I'm doing and not something that's real and out there in the world. Now, I mean, that said, of course, sometimes things that seem random really aren't random. So it's not like, it's not like you can always say, oh, that's just randomness. But I think if I had to guess, we tend to assume that there's structure when there isn't way more often than the other way.
When you're looking back on your own life, how has understanding game theory benefited the direction of your life?
It's really helped me a lot in these kinds of interpersonal interactions. So negotiations, both the kind of formal negotiations, like when I negotiated my most recent contract for my job, but also informal negotiations. Like you said, like interacting with my wife all the time where, I'm thinking through, and sometimes to my own detriment, sometimes I get to stop being the game theorist, but thinking those ways through. And especially, I think the thing that really shaped me as I started to learn this is to stop thinking about things in so much win-loss, zero-sum ways. Because that really was, I think I was sort of more disposed to thinking of that way when I was a younger person, like I need to win and they need to lose kind of thing. And when I started studying game theory and started realizing how many things that game theorists used to think were zero-sum, but now they don't think are zero-sum, that just started to think to myself, like, oh, wait, there's so many more opportunities out in the world for win-win solutions, for things that can benefit both people. I needed to stop thinking in that way. And so I think that maybe if I had to say one thing, recognizing that even things that initially feel like they might be zero-sum are not zero-sum, maybe is the thing that's made the biggest difference for me.
Cool. And if you're looking back over the last 12 months, what's something that's happened or you've done or you've experienced that you're really proud of?
Oh, man. It's been a busy... I'm writing this book. It's more an academic book, but it's about how we learn in social groups, and that's something I'm really proud. I just read through the full draft of it, and I was like, oh, man, this is better than I had remembered it, or at least not as bad as I feared it would be. So that's something I'm really proud of. I think that's something that's really good. The other thing is we're starting this new thing here at Carnegie Mellon called the Institute for Complex Social Dynamics, and that was something that I negotiated for, and so that's maybe a real win for game theory, is that was a case where I needed to talk to the dean of the college, who's sort of, my boss's boss, and I needed to convince him to invest money in this. And so I did exactly what I described. I sat down and said, what are his interests, and what are the ways that I can pitch him this idea that will coincide with what he wants? We both want the university to do well, but he's always got somebody in his ear asking for money. And so I've got to be like, what is it? How does this fit his interests more than a lot of the other things that he's thinking about? And so I sat down and made those lists, and it worked. We got a good amount of money, and we're just starting that new institute. And it was, I really do think it was because I sat and carefully thought about what are his interests and how is it that I can make this fit his interests.
Yeah. Do you mind sharing a little bit about how much time that took, that process of actually sitting down and thinking it? Because I think people underestimate it.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Because I did exactly the thing that I'm telling everyone not to do. My first thought was well, this is a good idea. It's good for the institution. It'll make us better. And he wants what's good for the institution. So I'll just tell him why it's good for the institution.
I'm going to the office right now.
Right now. Yeah. I was ready to go. And then thankfully, his calendar was full. And so I didn't have a meeting for a couple of weeks. And so I, just wrote down my notes for my pitch to myself. And then I was a couple days later, I'm let me look back at that. And then I was wait a minute, I'll bet he gets a lot of those. And I'll bet I'm not the only one giving him the same kind of pitch. So then I had to start thinking about, okay, wait a minute, what are his interests? More specifically than he wants the institution to do well, in what ways does he want it to do well? And in what ways might it be failing to do well that this thing could fix? So how is it, where's the niche that this can fit in his mind about how he thinks about it? I was lucky because I actually know the dean pretty well. He was promoted from being my immediate boss to being my boss's boss. So I've had a lot of interactions with him. And so I started to think about how does he think about the institution? What is it that he wants for it? And how can this be something that fills a gap for him? And so that was the first layer. But then that even wasn't that good. And so thankfully another couple of days went by and I thought about it. So time is really valuable. And at least for me, maybe different people are different, but for me, always writing something down, setting it aside, going away, coming back with fresh eyes, and then forcing myself to be is this really the right description of what his interests are? That's what really helps me. So the more lead time I have, the better. And also the better that I know a person. As I said, it helped that I knew this person really, really well because I knew what his interests were way more than if he was a stranger.
Yeah. I find that the hardest part is, I don't know why, I have a lot of resistance around that. I'll write down my first draft or whatever, and then I'm cool, good enough. I'll figure the rest out, on the spot. And the difference is more than 2x of returning. It's a 5-10x result when I revisit it and do that extra level of prep is wild.
No, it's so, and this is something that I say to, people in college all the time. I'm don't turn in your first draft of a paper, or don't turn in your first draft of a homework assignment or something like that, because if you can get yourself to forget what you wrote and come back to it, it's like two people looked at it. And so it's just, it's so valuable to do something, set it aside, give yourself a little breathing room, and then come back to it. If you can, of course, you can't always do that, but if you can, I think that's so valuable in everything, not just game theory. That's everything.
Yeah. Maybe you already asked this question, but looking forward into, did I say maybe you've already asked this question? Maybe you've already answered this question, but looking forward on the coming 12 months, what are you really excited about? It might be some of the things you mentioned already, but is there anything else really excited about?
Yeah, the things that I mentioned already, finishing that book, getting it finished, getting this institute started, those are the things that I'm super excited about. And, we're Carnegie Mellon University, where I am, is this really exciting place. It's growing really fast, so we're going to be hiring new people, and we're changing the direction of the department a little bit, not a big change, the philosophy department at Carnegie Mellon. I'm just really excited about that. There are so many young people coming into the institution, and so I'm just really excited about, I'm in charge of hiring somebody this year. I've already taken a peek at the applicants, even though it's before the deadline, and I just think it's going to be really great. So I'm just very excited, especially to be involved with this organization and trying to get it to, it's already great, but getting it to be even better.
Amazing. Thanks, man. That was an absolute pleasure.
Great. Thank you very much for having me.